Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. A walk through the front lines today. Sorry, I'm a little bit later than normal. It's Sunday and, life. Anyway, so let's have a look at our map of Ukraine. There has been a bit of a lull in terms of the overnight and morning attacks by cruise missiles, S-300s and Iranian drones from the Russians over the past few days, ever since that initial burst of activity that took out a lot of the energy infrastructure. Anyway, that has now ramped back up. So we have seen the Russians attack energy infrastructure in this kind of northern area, like northwest, so quite a long way from, from the front lines, and energy infrastructure around this kind of central southern area. This has been an attack on electricity substations. So although the Ukrainians are okay in producing power, I think some of their power stations are operating way below capacity, obviously without much need for industrial energy usage. Even though some of their energy production has been hit, they're able to cope with production still, but it's all about the distribution. And this is what the Russians have been very sort of strategic in hitting. So a lot of these energy substations have been hit, meaning that the energy infrastructure becomes fragmented and you don't get even distribution. So that is a real worry going forwards. And exactly as I said before, one place that's been particularly hard hit overnight is Mykolaiv, which is down in this southern area, not far at all from Kherson. So this is Kherson, Mykolaiv. This was the advance that the Russians were hoping to make on their way towards getting Odessa, particularly at the beginning of the war. And that got stopped just between Mykolaiv and Kherson, and has been like that ever since. Well, so that's not that one. So this, S-300s they're using, which are primarily surface-to-air missiles, but they can be used inaccurately in ground attacks, and that is what has been happening. So here's a 5-story residential building, apartment block, destroyed by Russia. That's the kind of destruction that they are bringing to primarily residential areas. And here's an alternative video that's the devastation brought to Mykolaiv this morning. Officials said only one person was injured. Air raid warnings were sounding at the time. But that is absolutely, the destructive force of these missiles as they wreak havoc in residential areas is pretty evident there. So the Ukrainians say they shot down 16 more of the Shahed UAVs overnight. So it's interesting. I wasn't aware that they fly particularly overnight, but obviously they do. 11 of the kamikaze attack drones were intercepted over Mykolaiv Oblast in particular, although the region suffered heavy damage in cruise missile attacks. So there you go. It's all happening, particularly in Mykolaiv. It's worth noting that Zaporizhzhia, so the Zaporizhzhia, just to let you know, is here. So this is the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, of which maybe 2/3 of that is occupied by the Russians and a third remains in Ukrainian hands. So here, also in Zaporizhzhia, the armed forces of Ukraine claim to have killed around 100 Russian fighters and destroyed 5 units and weapons and military equipment in strikes on Russia's position in the occupied part of the region. And this could well be sort of HIMARS attacks hitting down in the Zaporizhzhia area. Now, HIMARS have been somewhat absent from the Kherson region. They've been quite quiet on that front, maybe been pulled up to use elsewhere. But now I think they are continuing to hit areas in Kherson, and there were sort of pontoon bridges right next to the Antonivsky bridge here. There's been a Russian pontoon bridge that's built to ferry things across the Dnieper River, but that was hit the other day, and the Ukrainians continue to hit these. The Russians are claiming that they are hitting civilians as much as military infrastructure, but Ukrainians will say otherwise. I think the end result is that actually the Russians have lost quite a bit of material down there. Also, Crimea, there has been a ban on filming, I think, within Crimea, because they are, I think they must be getting places hit in Crimea. But I don't know too much information about that. But they sort of ban filming so that information doesn't get out of where installations are and whatnot. Okay, let's go to the front lines, and we'll start up in the northeast in the Oskil region. But actually, before we go there, I was telling you that there was a place actually in the Kharkiv Oblast near the Russian border where Russians have made an incursion. So just south of Voshansk. And indeed, this is what the Institute for the Study of War is. Oops, if I can get to the right place. They've been saying this as well. So where are you? Oh yeah, and also I need to tell you about Prigozhin, but I'll tell you about that later with regard to Wagner and the Wagner line. So here it is. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled a Russian ground attack near Ternova, 20 kilometers southwest of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv Oblast. So there is this sort of attempt at an incursion on the borders, possibly to distract. I don't think it's too serious. It's just a case of distracting attention away from other areas. So let's go to the Oskil region. This is from Kupiansk to Svatove-Kreminna, and there have been reports of a huge amount of attacks either way. But actually, it seems like the Ukrainians have ramped up a little bit of offensive around here, as we will just discuss. So this is my Google map of the area, and I talked previously about. So this is up northeast of Kupiansk. We've got Svatove here. So you've got the highway that connects Kupiansk to Svatove, and then Svatove go down to Kreminna, where you've got the P66 highway, and you've also got a rail link, and you've got a river, the Krasna River, and you've got the Kherson River here, and the Oskil River here. Okay, so you've got three rivers, and the Kherson River has been basically the backbone of the Ukrainian front line here, as you can see. But I'm just going to go a little bit further north, and I talked to you about how northeast of Kupiansk there was Russians did come to control the village of Avdivka. Not a lot of information around there. I believe that that's still all sort of contested around there, and it's things happening further down south as the Ukrainians are moving towards a number of places. So let's get towards Svatove. And we've got Orlyansk, where Orlyansky. The Ukrainians are moving again towards Orlyansky. That seems to be an area where they are attacking. Avdivka is confirmed liberated, and Kislivka is under pressure from the Ukrainians as well. So they're pushing towards Orlyansky and Kislivka. Of course, that seems to be where it was anyway, but there seems to be revamped attacks going on there. And if we come further down south, so past Svatove to Mykolaiv, and Ukrainian forces are apparently amassing here quite a bit, and there's this strike out possibly from Mykolaiv, and it looks like the Ukrainians might strike out to hit this P66 highway. So if you remember back a week or so ago, between 1 week and 2 weeks ago, I was saying that they had crossed this P66 highway, and they did have a little foothold in Krasnoyarzynsky, and a bit further south from there as well. So they had actually got the other side of the Krasna River in Krasnoyarzynsky. Well, it seems like that's then receded, and they've pulled back to this line here. Well, Mykolaiv, it seems that they might be striking out from Mykolaiv. They could either go up north to Svatove or down south to Kreminna. I think Svatove is, like I've long said, that should be the major objective. So I don't know whether there's this move to the south and a move to the north in some kind of wide-reaching pincer movement. But there's certainly a lot of activity going on there. There are claims of the Russians have claimed that the Ukrainians are pushing hard in these areas. On the other hand, Terny here is this is his pocket where the Russians have sort of done a counterattack and keep putting pressure on. And I said that they've almost certainly recaptured Dubrova, but they are shelling Torsky, Zarishny, Yampovlivka, and Terny. And Terny seems to be this fairly contested place at the moment. So I think, you know, there seem to be reports from both sides that you know, Terny is contested. So I just, move the line a little bit further back. It doesn't really make an awful lot of difference, but that just goes to show that there is stuff going on there all the time. And in fact, Institute for the Study of War, I'll just very quickly read you what they're saying. So the Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces conducted counteroffensive operations in the direction of Kreminna and Svatove on October the 22nd. So the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Russian forces repelled a Ukrainian assault in the direction of Kuzimivka, which is just northwest of Svatove, near the N26 highway that leads into Svatove from the north. Russian MOD also claimed that their forces repelled Ukrainian attacks northwest of Kreminna near Novovodyanne and I'm not going to even say it, Chernopopivka. There you go. A Russian military blogger claimed that Russian forces repelled a Ukrainian assault west of Kreminna near Terny. Okay, so these are the areas I've just been talking about. A Russian Combat Reserve affiliated Telegram channel claimed that artillery units repelled an attempted Ukrainian advance north of Kreminna. So that they also claimed that Ukrainian maneuvers near Terny and Novosadove suggested that Russian forces lack continuous defensive positions along the R66 Svatove-Kreminna highway, despite previous claims of Russian sources to the contrary. Of course, they can't confirm that, but what this says is that it looks like the Ukrainians really are pushing for this highway. Again, this is Chernopopivka, so you can see that that's quite a long way from where I've got the front line here, but the Russian sources are saying this is under pressure from Ukrainians, and they are trying to do something about this highway that connects Kreminna down here up to Svatove up here. So pressure along here, it's hard to know exactly where the forces are. This is just a massive, I would say, this whole highway area is just a massive grey zone. There's a huge grey zone from there down to here, and particularly in this pocket there. I think things are going to be maybe moving in over this next sort of 24, 48 hours in a way that we haven't seen for a week now. So there you go. That's what's happening there. I'm going to now talk about Prigozhin. So this is moving down south, further south towards Bakhmut. So we move past this conurbation of Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Rubizhny, and Kreminna, and we come down to this Bakhmut area. So before I talk to you about Bakhmut, I told you about this defensive line that the Wagner PMC, the Wagner group, are building of Dragon's Teeth and trenches that go sort of back from the front line up here, loops around just sort of to the west of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and comes back down here and then follows broadly this river right across to the Russian border. And this has been a much sort of lauded thing that the Wagner have done. But the issue is, and I talked about how it shows that they're defensive-minded rather than being offensive-minded. It shows that actually they're worried about being attacked by the Ukrainians. And it sort of says, well, we're okay with giving up all this northeastern area up here because we're building these defenses along almost our 2014 route. But they're also talking about defenses into the Belgorod region and all sorts. Anyway, it's apparently causing a bit of an issue within Russia. So here's what the ISW say, the Institute for the Study of War. Wagner Group financier Prigozhin continues to create rifts within the Russian government by publicizing the so-called Wagner line of fortifications in northeast Ukraine, which appears misaligned with Kremlin-led narratives on the course of the war. So the Kremlin has said, right, we're offensively taking all these areas, and then Prigozhin saying, well, we're putting up this defense here because we're afraid of being overrun. Then there's two narratives going on. Prigozhin and Wagner affiliated channels, Telegram channels, announced that Russian regional officials paused the extension of the Wagner line fortifications that run behind the line of contacts in Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts and into Russia's Belgorod Oblast. Prigozhin accused the Russian bureaucracy, which he characterized as bureaucratic enemies, of, quote, directly opposing the the interests of the population and not protecting the Russian population by supporting the construction of the line. The Russian nationalist community has repeatedly accused the Kremlin of failing to defend the Belgorod Oblast border, and Prigozhin may be attempting to amplify their demands. The Kremlin is likely attempting to maintain its limited framing of the war, which will likely continue to upset the nationalist community that is seemingly concerned by the lack of defences around Belgorod Oblast. Prigozhin and Wagner-affiliated Telegram channels previously indicated that there is an ongoing schism within the Kremlin's power circles between officials that are hesitant to continue the war due to personal interests and those in favour of Russian total victory. Okay, so broadly, that's indicative of this issue between Prigozhin, who was apparently positioning himself for taking over the defense minister, Shoigu falling out of favor, but now he seems to be upsetting, people in power in the Kremlin, and there's a rift between Wagner and Prigozhin and the Kremlin, which is a problem because the Wagner mercenaries seem to be the only Russian troops that are doing a half decent job of attacking and war. But there you go. Anyway, if we then move to Bakhmut, not a lot has changed, but I think there's this sort of idea that the Russians are going for a wider encirclement. Bakhmut is really well defended, and it's got some of the top Ukrainian units in there, and they're doing a really good job. And I showed yesterday how there's like helicopters working around here. They've got there's now been Polish tanks have been seen around here. This is a well defended city, and a full frontal assault is just not going to work. And in fact, it appears that they have pulled out. So this is my crappy map version. It appears that they've actually really pulled out. So I said that there was a grey zone before. This is my earlier map, and I said they've advanced a little bit in the fields here, and they advanced towards Klizchivka, but there doesn't seem to be any real news of them doing anything around here. So this might be actually a more accurate line now, but without this grey zone. So it appears they're not really contesting the eastern suburbs at the moment, according to some sources, and that they are going for a much wider encirclement. So although they're not getting anywhere in Soledar and Bakhmutsky, which is this area here, it's just to the northeast of Bakhmut, but they might be going for a much wider encirclement, operating from further north and further south here. And if they can encircle it, then this would eventually force the Ukrainians out without having to do too much warfare, as I keep saying, a bit like that happened in Liman. So that's Bakhmut. Yes, I was just looking into something there. So as we move further down from Bakhmut, we go down, and my map doesn't really. I gave up doing my map in there. I need to just continue that front line down to Avdivka and Donetsk here. So we're going to now look at Avdivka, which is a really similar situation in a sense to Bakhmut, which is a town that is being very difficult to overcome. It's just, not a hugely great settlement. It's on the outskirts of a huge city or a big occupied city, but the Russians can't seem to punch a hole. I mean, it kind of shows how impotent they are in many ways in terms of, this massive army can't take Bakhmut and can't take Avdivka after all this time, and they're just beating. They can't even take Pervomaisky, which is, a tiny settlement. It's hugely contested, but you think surely you've got enough to overcome this, but they clearly don't, and that is really indicative to me of the poor offensive capabilities of Russia. And actually capacity, like they clearly can't have enough troops to commit to this and overrun it in some kind of Pyrrhic victory. But there you go. So what the Russians apparently are doing again in Avdivka, as they are possibly in Bakhmut, is a wider encirclement. So instead of going just north here, where they're having a little trouble to encircle closer to Avdivka, they look to be striking out further north of Avdivka and encircling it in a much wider encirclement, as well as putting a lot of effort into places further south of Avdivka and Marinka and other places. So there is stuff potentially happening with a wider encirclement. And actually in Zaporizhia Oblast, there, as we move further on down towards Kherson, there are pockets of attacks, actually Ukrainian attacks over the last couple of days in a few of these settlements. But, not too much detail there and not enough to warrant sort of spending too much time on. So this is, as we move to Kherson, it's worth noting a couple of things. Internet has almost gone in Kherson. I'm not sure what that tells you, whether that is for reasons of Russians doing something or Ukrainians doing something to take out Russian capability or whatever. But it's probably reflective of something. The internet has just completely dropped off in Kherson very recently, and something a few people are reporting on: the gas stations and pharmacies in Kherson now refuse to accept rubles, going back to the Ukrainian currency, hryvnias. Probably pronounce it very poorly. Employees refer to the instructions of the superiors. There's also a gasoline shortage in the city. A number of gas stations are not working. Okay, so this is quite an interesting scenario whereby it shows how difficult it is to get supplies from anywhere to Kherson. Really, get across that Dnieper River, where the Kherson is sitting on that right bank. Remember, right bank is the direction of flow of the river. If you're going down the river, then the right hand side is this side, and the left hand side is this side. But basically, to the west, this western region, they are just not getting fuel. I'm not talking about these villages out here, but actually in Kherson. So I think things are closing in for the Russian troops around there, and they're not looking great. It's not looking great for them, and it's just kind of this slow constriction. Anyway, if we go to the front line here, and I'm having a bit of trouble with the deep state map. It doesn't seem to be rendering particularly well at the moment. So I might have to just maybe go to one of my old maps and give you a little looky-see. So in Kherson, I talked to you about this being the case some time ago. And I said, basically, really, the Russians claim this red line, the Ukrainians claim this blue line. Actually, and more recently, the Ukrainians claimed the red line as their blue line. So realistically, if you imagine the red line is the latest sort of border claims, if we go to the deep state map, you can see that here. So Piachatsky over to Ducheny, right? So that is Ducheny to there. So that's where they're seeing it. But what's interesting is there have been some claims now that these two places. So I said yesterday there were some claims about Staritsia being liberated, and I only saw that in sort of one source. Didn't hear much about it. But then I've also seen today that Chklaulove and Cherivne down here have been liberated, and you're thinking, wow, so this is quite interesting. That's quite a long way into behind the Russian front lines. I don't know. I can't find an awful lot of information on this, but there are some claims, and there's going to be a lot of operational security going on. So media blackout. You don't hear about what's going on, but the claims are that the Russians pulled out of these places, and this could be rather than, I guess, the Ukrainians liberating them. So maybe that's a bit more accurate to say that, which is to say that this could be reflective of the Russians pulling out. And there have been, further claims that its mobilized troops are being pulled into the Kherson front line, and more experienced troops are pulling out. In other words, they are kind of sacrificing mobilized poorer troops to get out their decent troops, to save the decent troops so they can use them again, rather than for them to get caught in here and either liquidated or turned into prisoners of war. So that's a situation that appears to still be going on. There could well be advances taking place today. Who knows? But I think there is a bit of movement possibly starting in the Kherson region, and a lot of that is also going to be down to Russians pulling out as much as Ukrainians pulling forward. So Ukrainians pushing forward could just be to represent the falling back and the tactical withdrawal of the Russian troops, which is something I advised before that they should do, which is you're going to lose this area eventually, death by 1,000 cuts. You might as well lose this on your terms and get your Russian troops out of there and your equipment out as well as you can. But as I say, the HIMARS are operating and they are hitting stuff around the Kherson area again. And I believe the Russians are losing a fair decent bit of equipment. Anyway, there you go. Thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, share, and put your comments below. Your comments are always really, really useful on my threads. I'm really impressed. If you want to support me, you can buy me a coffee, or there's PayPal or YouTube thanks, all that kind of stuff. Or if you want, you can buy some stash, uasupporter.com/ATP. And I get a tiny bit of commission. So look, you can even go to home goods like flags and pillowcases, patches, keychains, mouse pads. There you go. Look, you can get a Ukrainian mouse pad and show your support for Ukraine in that way. If you're Russian, maybe not. Thank you for your support. Take care, and I'll try and get an extra out later. It's going to be a pretty busy day, but I'll certainly try and do a short one. Cheers.